This video will be a critical look at the claims of Gregg Braden. I hope that you will consider the points that I make. I tried very hard to make sure that I was not nitpicking, but rather only selecting things to debunk that were central to Braden's overall theories. I think that you will find early on that to say that there are serious problems with his research would be a massive understatement. I was quite surprised at the level of deceit that he is capable of. One of the reasons is because he is very disarming. He seems like the kind of guy that you can trust. He is always quoting scientific papers, and some researchers said this, or scientists now know that, and similar things. If you have seen my videos like 2012 Deception Presentation, or How 2012 Enlightenment Will Lead to Genocide, you will see that he is a picture-perfect example of the people I described there, even down to his mystical experience on Mount Sinai, where he claims to have been given his information about the coming enlightenment. If you have time, check out those two previous videos of mine to see how Braden's main thesis of a shift of ages and/or 0 point could be used to benefit a nefarious agenda. This video is divided into small sections, each one with a separate topic. If you would like to view it in a continuous video, go to my website, the2012deception.net, and you can also download it for free there. Feel free to distribute this video any way that you see fit. Also, I've tried to make it a point to document my important claims in the description sections of each video. If you would like to see a comprehensive list of these links and notes, go to the2012deception.net. Enjoy. Mr. Braden is about to talk about something known as the Schumann resonance, but before he does, I want to quickly explain to you what it is, because it will help you understand the point that I will make later. The global electromagnetic resonance phenomenon is named after physicist Winfried Otto Schumann, who predicted it mathematically in 1952. Schumann resonances occur because the space between the surface of the Earth and the conductive ionosphere acts as a closed waveguide. The limited dimensions of the Earth causes this waveguide to act as a resonant cavity for electromagnetic waves in the ELF band. The cavity is naturally excited by electric currents in lightning. The lightning and sometimes solar input will cause these electromagnetic waves to bounce in between the cavity created by the Earth and the ionosphere. They appear as a pretty consistent set of 5 harmonics. Try to think of it like guitar strings when you're playing a chord. The low frequency is 7.8, then 14.3, 20.8, 27.3, and then 33.8 Hertz. The one that will get the most attention in a few moments is the lowest, or bass frequency. It is often stated that the Schumann resonance is 7.8 Hertz. This would tend to indicate a high precision of measurement, but it's actually due to a high degree of averaging, like saying that the average family has 2.3 children. You can see here on this graph that on average the change of this frequency is actually very slight, and it ranges only from about 7.6 to just under 8 Hertz. In fact, very precise equipment is needed to measure this slight change. And the reasons for the slight changes are well known to scientists. Although there are other factors, the primary reason that there are changes in this number is because of lightning strikes. If you look up anything on Schumann resonance in the scientific literature, you will see that everyone knows that these slight variations are caused by lightning strikes. But you will never hear Braden mention this. You will hear him say that it is the Earth's pulse and other things making you think it has to do with something from inside the Earth, because this will help him as he tries to develop his story. So now let's hear Braden talk about the Schumann resonance.
Now, at the same time, there is another parameter that is unfolding within our experience right now, and it is simply called bass resonant frequency. It's a fundamental vibration. It's a fundamental heartbeat of the Earth. Every time the Earth pulses, every 1 second of our experience, when the Earth pulses electromagnetically, that pulse traditionally, historically, has been a certain number of beats per second, or cycles per second, or hertz.
Actually, the Hertz is calculated by the number of times the electromagnetic waves travel around the Earth per second. It's totally dependent on the size of the Earth and the speed of light. It's not the Earth's heartbeat in any way.
As the term is called. Traditionally, that number has been about 7.8. This number was first measured directly back in 1899 and 1900. And all the way through the early part of this century, through the 20s and the 30s, throughout World War I, World War II, all up in the 1950s, as late as the early 1980s, this number held constant, approximately 7.8 cycles per second. It is such a constant that actually in 1958 there was a meeting of a global meeting of technological countries that agreed from 1958 on not to publish the base resonant frequency of the Earth, not to publish that information, because it became a fundamental communications frequency, and later was key in new weapon systems, electromagnetic weapon systems, based on this fundamental heartbeat of the Earth. That was the IGY, the International Geophysical Year.
This is just not true. There are many stations which measure the Schumann resonance, such as the one at Stanford. In addition, you can find study after study that utilizes published Schumann resonance data, and all of it is past 1958. The International Geophysical Year that he mentioned had nothing that I can find either on the agenda or any of the notes about banning the use of the Schumann resonance measurements, and if they did do so and didn't say anything about it, they did a terrible job of it, because there is lots of published information about the Schumann resonance.
Well, we believed up until recently that this number 7.8 was a constant, that every second that we experience that Earth pulses a certain number of times. Well, something interesting began to happen in the again in the mid to late 1980s. What we see is this. There's 7.0, here's 8, 7.8, all the way through 1970s, 1980. In the mid to late 1980s, 86, 87, right around in there, that number began to increase mysteriously. And it went from 7.8 to 8 to 8.23 to 8.6. At the end of 1995, the number was validated at 8.6 cycles per second. In just a few years, it had been a constant throughout the time that we had been measuring this parameter. Now, in early 1996, researchers are reporting numbers as high as 9 cycles per second. While I have not seen that directly, those are the reports that are coming in.
Here I've compiled the data from 2 separate data collection sources measuring the Schumann resonance and superimposed them on each other to give a timeline from about 1990 to 2003. Scientists have always seen this fluctuation based on lightning and solar input from the beginning. It was never, as Braden says, always been a constant at 7.8 and then mysteriously starts climbing. That's not true. In fact, it usually has a slightly different reading almost every day. Having an odd reading every once in a while is normal and usually based on a bad lightning storm somewhere in the Earth, but it's always only a slightly different reading. Also, you can see that in 1995, in which Braden says the Schumann resonance had rose to 8.6, it actually appears to be about the lowest average level of the frequency, certainly not the steady climb he has on his graph in the background. Which is also kind of funny because he has recorded this in 1996, which is where the last inner box in his graph behind him ends, which means that the incredible spike that he has drawn is his prediction for where it will be in a few years. But you can see, based on this information, that it clearly never did that. But the best evidence that the Schumann resonance is not rising is that the only way for it to be a physical possibility would be for the Earth to change size or the speed of light to change drastically, which is not going to happen. I will again quote from this article, which is in the description section, which says, "The primary Schumann resonance is the lowest frequency of these standing waves, with the wavelength being the circumference of the Earth. Strictly speaking, the circumference of the cavity created by the inner edge of the ionosphere, approximately 35 miles above the Earth. For electromagnetic radiation, the wavelength multiplied by the frequency equals the speed of light. So it follows that to calculate the primary Schumann resonance frequency, you divide the speed of light by the circumference of the Earth. The result is 7.8 times per second, or 7.8 hertz. To put it another way, electromagnetic waves travel around the Earth 7.8 times per second. It's elementary physics. The figure actually fluctuates by plus or minus 0.5 hertz. Daily, as the ionosphere fluctuates, as neither the speed of light nor the circumference of the Earth is changing, it follows that the primary Schumann resonance is not going to change either unless the laws of physics change." Braden then introduces some real science, which is the Fibonacci sequence, and he talks about it for a little while and describes how interesting it is. And then, out of nowhere, he simply applies it to the Schumann resonance and says that the Schumann resonance is somehow governed by the Fibonacci sequence. For a hilarious debunking on this, see the link in the description section. But basically, Braden concludes that the Earth pulse is going to increase from 8 Hz, close to the Schumann 7.8, to the next line in the Fibonacci number, or target frequency, as he has now named it, of 13 Hz. No reason is given to support this. In fact, the idea is absurd, and what the Fibonacci numbers have to do with this is a mystery. And I will end this section by showing how Braden makes some of these connections, as I think it's pretty interesting to watch his progress, but also to hear some of the conclusions that he draws afterwards.
So, historically, Earth has hovered around 8 cycles per second, 7.8, just under 8 cycles per second. We are moving quickly now beyond that. Researchers now suspect that we're moving to the next element in this series that governs the heartbeat of the Earth, the lucky number 13, 13 cycles per second, right here. Now this is important. This is important to you. Here's the reason why. What I have just done is I've given you now 2 digitally measurable parameters of the Earth. These are the parameters now that dictate much of our experience in terms of cellular, genetic, and emotional response to what we call life. They are governed by this series of numbers. Now what we're seeing happening is this. With just this information now, you have enough information for yourself that you are able to develop a context within which all of the other things that we will do in these next few hours, all of the events of your life are unfolding within the context of these parameters. And let me show you why this is important to you. What we're seeing is this. The magnetics are falling quickly, apparently moving toward a time of 0-point magnetics. No magnetics on Earth. Frequency is increasing quickly, apparently moving toward or possibly reaching a threshold fundamental resonance of 13 cycles per second, 13 Hertz. The day that that happens, the day that these 2 parameters become very, very close, possibly meeting, that point, that innocent-looking little point right there, that's the day that every belief system that I'm aware of, that I've ever studied, every religion, all of the sacred orders and the mystery schools is not a new phenomenon. I have a drawing here. It's a text page right out of the textbook, so it's a little difficult to see. And what I'll point out to you is this. This is a time scale. Present time is at the top. Ancient time is at the bottom. This scale represents 4.5 million years. 4.5 million years. And what we're seeing here, the 2 columns that I'll call your attention to, is this column right here, of these little boxes, and then right next to it, this column right here. And what these columns represent, each of these blocks represents a period of geologic time when Earth was oriented either north-south, the way we know it now, or north-south reversed. So for example, this block right here represents a long period of time when the north and south poles of the Earth were identical to what we now. And this is another time when they were identical, and look how short this period of time is. This column represents periods of geologic time when our north and south poles were just the opposite of what we are right now. So what you see is that many times throughout Earth's history, this is why I'm showing you this slide, many times throughout Earth's history, Earth has gone through a 180-degree magnetic polar reversal. We see at least 14 times in the last 4.5 million years, right here, that we have had this polar reversal.
At this point, Braden is telling us more or less true science. If he only stopped right here, I would agree with him. But he wants to use this data to not only say that we are expecting a pole shift in the next few years, but that it will have all kinds of dramatic effects on the population. But let's look at the data for ourselves. Every switch in polarity occurs when the field is at its weakest. You can see this on this graph, where the arrows at the bottom are showing the low points in the magnetic field, and they correspond to the pole reversal change on the top portion of the graph. Braden seems to have this part more or less correct. Even the fact that though this process appears to be random, pole reversals are usually preceded by a rapid drop in the magnetic field. What Braden will never mention is that according to all known data, this rapid drop takes about 20,000 to 40,000 years of fairly continuous decay in field strength to complete. In this context, a couple of centuries worth of field decay is not particularly significant, especially since the present field strength, about 8 on the scale in this figure, is still a lot higher than the value reached during all of these reversals. And even if we were presently in a free fall of magnetic field strength, based on our present strength, the field would still need to continue weakening for a few thousand more years and reach a much lower strength before a reversal is going to happen. But let's just say that we were at the lowest field strength necessary for a reversal. Another thing that Braden fails to mention is this, that a full reversal sequence is not an instantaneous event. The following is a quote from Chris Rowan, who is a PhD geologist specializing in paleomagnetism. Our compasses will not point north today and south tomorrow. Instead, the geomagnetic field will weaken, and the magnetic poles will start to wander to the lower latitudes and possibly multiply over a period of hundreds or even thousands of years. It looks dramatic from the perspective of deep time in these graphs, but during a reversal, the changes over a human lifetime will probably be little different from the secular variation we see today. No extinction event has ever been linked to a magnetic field reversal, and I think that we might just cope with the next one too, whenever it might occur. And because this idea is part of the centerpiece for Braden's whole theory of the so-called 0 point, I will spend just one more second on it as I explain that even at a low point of magnetics, the field does not disappear, it just becomes more complicated. I will be quoting a NASA article in this next clip, but if you don't trust NASA, like me, you can go check out their science for yourself to see if what they are saying is true or not, independently, and it is. Actual pole shifts that do occur, both magnetic pole shifts and physical pole shifts. And we are in the middle of a long process of a magnetic pole shift. The biggest effect of which is that we will have to relabel our compasses in a few hundred years. The following is an excerpt from an article from NASA. Reversals take a few thousand years to complete, and during the time, contrary to popular belief, the magnetic field does not vanish. It just gets more complicated, says Glatzmeyer. Magnetic lines of force near Earth's surface become twisted and tangled, and magnetic poles pop up in unaccustomed places. A south magnetic pole might emerge over Africa, for instance, or a north pole over Tahiti. Weird, but it's still a planetary magnetic field, and it still protects us from space radiation and solar storms.
The most recent that we're aware of through the geologic evidence appears to be between 11 and 13,000 years ago, right around in there. It coincides very well with Plato's accounts of the sinking of Atlantis.
This is totally untrue. According to the geological data, the last flip was 780,000 years ago, not 11,500 years ago. The 11,500 years ago date is coming from the end of the Younger Dryas cold period, which is noted by the Greenland ice cores, which is weird because he later says that the Greenland ice cores data corresponds to his 3,600-year-old data, which he says he gets from the ancient texts. But what he really means is Zecharia Sitchin. Basically what he's referring to is that 11,500 years ago there was a temperature change as evidenced by the Greenland ice cores. He's basically saying temperature change equals magnetic pole shift, which is not true, and it would actually be referring to a physical pole shift, not a magnetic one, which is what we've been talking about the whole time. And I might add, a physical pole shift definitely did not happen 11,500 years ago. He's also ignoring the fact that if a shift such as this did occur, Greenland would have gotten colder and not warmer.
And the biblical flood and some of the geologic evidence that we see in Egypt and the Middle East. Ancient texts, however, indicate that we may have experienced one of these polar reversals as recently as 3,500 to 3,600 years ago. 3,500 to 3,600 years ago. The traditions and the prophecies of many of the indigenous peoples seem to indicate that 3,500 years ago is not long enough to find in a geologic record. So we wouldn't expect to see it in a rock record. Where we do see evidence of this is in the ice records, in the Greenland ice caps, in the Antarctic ice caps. As we're taking measurements of oxygen and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere caught in little bubbles. Something was happening 3,500 or 3,600 years ago. It also coincides very nicely to Zecharia Sitchin's work through his book, The 12th Planet, and many of the catastrophic events that he has indicated.
As far as Zecharia Sitchin goes, if you want, you can go to my video 2012 Debunked for a very quick treatment on this, but you can also go to a very detailed description at Dr. Michael Heiser's page, SitchinIsWrong.com, that shows that Sitchin is not only wrong about his interpretation of cylinder seal BA243, which is in play at this particular moment, but Heiser also shows that it is very unlikely that Sitchin even knows the basics of the language that he claims to be an expert on. Many years ago, I also used to believe Zecharia Sitchin. This website is a very eye-opening experience.
So we may have experienced in our world a 180-degree magnetic reversal as little as 3,500 years ago. To the best of my knowledge, this has never happened with 6.5 billion people living on the planet. And it appears that you and I are living the precursive days, the precursive experiences to precisely this experience and more. Well, Earth is in the process right now. Our rotation is slowing down. Earth is slowing down. And as it does so, these fields become weaker and weaker until the point that the fields collapse to zero. Okay? Now, I have to tell you, as a geologist, an ex-geologist, this, to me, is an outrageous thing for me to say to you. When I first began to understand this, I said, there is no way. And this little voice in my head would say, way, and I'd say, no way, and it would say, way, because it has happened before, and now as we're able to go back into the history, the written text and the non-written text, the geologic texts of our world, we see very clear evidence that this, in fact, has happened, that Earth, every once in a while, slows a rotation to a point where there is a rest period, there is no rotation, and it rests for a brief period of time and begins to increase the rotation again, and as it does so, it rotates in the opposite direction.
He has determined here that the magnetic flip that we talked about earlier occurs when the Earth reverses its direction of spin, which is absurd for several reasons. The first being that this would mean that the Earth has reversed its spin hundreds of times in its existence, which to say that there is no evidence for that would be a massive understatement. I'm going to quote now from an article that I'll link in the description section about this. Let's think about this for a minute. The Earth has a mass of nearly 6 billion trillion tons. That's 6 followed by 21 zeros. And the surface is traveling at about 1,000 miles per hour at the equator. Where is the huge amount of energy supposed to come from to stop the spin of this massive object and to get it to spin again in the opposite direction? Braden doesn't say. In fact, it is not discussed once in the many pages or the numerous diagrams that follow. He says in his book, quote, "The sun will rise and set from opposite directions relative to its present cycle," in page 47. But instead of quoting any actual scientific data to prove this massive claim, he quotes from the Bible, which I'll discuss here in just a second.
We have records. If this were to happen in recorded human history, I would certainly expect that it would have been, someone would have noticed it, and we would see it in our texts. And in fact, we do. We have at least one time, about 3,500 years ago, there's that number again. Now think about this. If Earth were ever to stop rotating on its axis, come to a rest, some portion of the Earth toward the sun would become very warm, and another portion would probably be very cool during the time that the rotation stopped. And that's precisely what we see in these texts. We see recorded in the Peruvian texts the long night that lasted almost 3 days, and at the same time, on the other side of the Earth, right here in the Middle East, what we see are biblical records of a long day that was over 20 hours long. The Hopi record a day where the sun rose twice in the same day. Now think about that. They call it the long day, where the sun rose once in the east and rose once in the west and set in the east, and later that day, the long day, 20 hours later, rose again in the east and set in the west, as it continues to do today.
Here Braden is referring to the so-called Long Day of Joshua from the book of Joshua in the Bible. In his book, Braden quotes from the Bible, which says, "The sun stayed in the midst of heaven and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day." The first thing that I would say is that if Braden wants to use the Bible to prove his claim about the earth changing its spin, I will use the Bible to disprove it. The Bible most definitely does not claim that the sun changed its directions from rising in the east to rising in the west on the long day of Joshua. In fact, in many parts of the Bible, both before and after this point, the sun is described as rising in the east. For instance, in Numbers 2, verse 3, which was way before the long day of Joshua event, it says, "And on the east side, towards the rising of the sun, shall they of the standard of the camp of Judah pitch throughout their armies." This totally refutes the idea from a biblical perspective. Not to mention that the Bible only says that the sun hastened to go down, not that it changed directions or anything like that. The fact remains, however, that something odd probably did happen with the Long Day of Joshua event, and I will give you a more plausible and mathematical explanation that will also help you to be able to refute some of the claims for Planet X that are also floating around. All early calendars appear to be based on a 360-day calendar. The Assyrians, Chaldeans, Egyptians, Hebrews, Persians, Greeks, Phoenicians, the Chinese, Mayans, Hindus, they were all based on a 360-day year, typically a 30-day month. In ancient Chaldea, the calendar was based on a 360-day year. It is from this Babylonian tradition that we have 360 degrees in a circle, 60 minutes to an hour, 60 seconds in each minute, etc. It is also significant that the biblical year is also based on a 360-day year reckoning. This critical insight unlocks several incredible prophecies, in particular the remarkable 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel chapter 9. All calendars change in 701 BC. In 701 BC, Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, reorganized the original calendar of 360 days per year by adding 5 days per year. King Hezekiah, Numa's contemporary, reorganized his Jewish calendar by adding a month each Jewish leap year, on a cycle of 7 every 19 years. The Roman year began with March, the month named after Mars. They later reorganized their calendar in 364 BC to begin on January 1st. Most of the early cultures organized their calendars around either March or October. Why? Why was there any change necessary after 701 BC? What happened to affect all the calendars after that year? Mars interferes. The recent space-age discovery of orbital resonance, the tendency of orbits to synchronize on multiples of one another, has led to a fascinating conjecture that the orbits of Earth and the planet Mars were once on a resonant orbit of 360 days and 720 days respectively. A computer analysis has suggested that this could yield orbital interactions that would include a near pass-by on a multiple of 54 years, and this would occur on either March 25th or October 25th. Such near pass-bys would transfer energy, altering the orbits of each. In near proximity, such pass-bys would be accompanied by meteors, severe land tides, earthquakes, etc. And this would help explain why all the ancient cultures were so terrified by the planet Mars, and why calendars tended to reflect either March or October. A series of such pass-bys could also explain a number of the catastrophes of ancient history, including the famous Long Day of Joshua, and several other biblical episodes. Stability appears to have been attained during the last near pass in 701 BC, resulting in Earth's and Mars's present orbits of 365¼ days and 387 days, respectively. This remarkable conjecture that Mars made pass-bys near the Earth would seem to be corroborated by Jonathan Swift, who died in 1745, in his famous fantasy known as Gulliver's Travels. In his third voyage, Gulliver visits the land of Laputa, where the astronomers brag that they know all about the 2 moons of Mars. Their highly detailed description includes the size, the rotation, the revolutions, etc. of each of the 2 moons. What makes this particular illusion so provocative is that the 2 moons of Mars were not discovered by astronomers until 151 years after Swift's publication of Gulliver's Travels in 1726. It was in 1877 that Ashford Hall, using a new telescope at the U.S. Naval Observatory, shocked the astronomical world by discovering the 2 moons of Mars. What makes the 2 moons so difficult to see is that they are only about 8 miles in diameter and have an albedo, or reflectivity, of only 3%. They are the darkest objects in the solar system. They are almost black. The two moons are also unique in their rotations, and one of them is the only object in the solar system that orbits in reverse. For Swift to have guessed these correctly is absurd. Yet, the telescopes of his day were inadequate to have actually seen these objects. But then how could he have known what the astronomers of his day did not? Swift, in order to embroider his satirical fiction, undoubtedly drew upon ancient records he probably assumed were simply legends, not realizing that they were actually eyewitness accounts of ancient sightings of Mars when it was close enough for the two moons of Mars to be viewed with the naked eye. In the description section, I'll link a number of sites that are doing the calculations about the angular momentum transfer between Earth and Mars on their near pass-bys.
So it may be that we have very good records, if we have the wisdom to recognize them, of exactly this process happening at least once at some point in recorded Earth history that I'd like to speak about as we're moving into this information is something called the photon belt. There's a lot of information, a lot of books out now, and people are talking about the photon belt.
The recent books and talk of the photon belt that he is referring to here started in 1991 when Australia's Nexus magazine wrote a story about the photon belt. Then in 1994, 2 years before Braden will record this video, Virginia Essene and Sheldon Niddle claimed to be in contact with beings from the star system of Sirius, who told them to write a book called You Are Becoming a Galactic Human. But based on what he's about to say, it's obvious that he's getting the information from another book that came out in 1994 called The Pleiadian Agenda by Barbara Hand Clow. She claims that she got all her information from Pleiadians, not Sirians, and everything that Braden is about to say comes word for word from that book.
Essentially what the photon belt is, in 1961, an astronomer named Robert Stanley began to detect particles of light, increased numbers of these particles, in the atmosphere of the Earth. They were called photons. And they've been measured since 1961, and they have continued to increase in density.
None of this is true. Robert Stanley didn't make some observations in 1961 about photons. In fact, it's unlikely that he was even an adult at that time. What Braden is probably referring to is a thing that people have said since the beginning of the photon belt idea, which was that in 1961 the photon belt was discovered by satellites. In fact, Robert Stanley, the guy Braden is wrongly quoting here, says exactly that in his article about the photon belt. He says that it was discovered in outer space by satellite-borne instruments in 1961. One possible reason that Braden is not quoting this correctly is because it's so wrong. There is no record of such satellite detection, nor is it likely that satellites in those days would have been equipped to make such observations. In addition, there's no evidence of a photon belt with modern-day equipment.
So what's happening is we are moving into a band, if you will, of greater and greater density, greater and greater particles of light.
Photons are basically light. It travels very fast and in straight lines. The idea that light is collecting in bands as described is not even physically possible. Sometimes people will show pictures of nebulas when describing the photon belt, and while nebulas can be very beautiful, they are simply made up of dust and gas and plasma, not photons.
Well, researchers now know that this band is a band that our solar system runs into, or actually passes through, once about every 26 to 27,000 years, somewhere right around in there, depending on which calendars we're looking at.
You can look at any calendar you want to, but for Gregg Braden's calculations to be correct, then the solar system must be traveling around the galaxy at 10% of the speed of light, which is 1,000 times faster than the Earth's orbit around the Sun. If this were true, the shape of the constellations would noticeably change within a single lifetime due to stellar parallax effects. There is no evidence of this. Moreover, to cause such an orbital speed by gravitational action, Alcyon, which is the place where they say that this photon belt is, would have to be over 1 billion times more massive than our Sun, thus rivaling the core of our own galaxy. And to make matters worse for Braden, we're actually moving away from the place that the photon belt is supposed to be.
And that it takes our solar system about 2,000 years for us to pass from one edge to the other of this band. And at the 1,000-year point, We are in the center of the band, the densest portion of the light that this photon belt has to offer. Now, there are texts out there from their perspective that have offered a scenario that to some people appears frightening. And there has been some concern about what it means to us, what it means to our lives as we pass into this photon belt. We're in the photon belt right now, and you're watching this video, and I'm able to record this video. Our material, our equipment is still functioning, and we're in this photon belt. What I believe is happening is that the interpretation of our time when we actually reach the midpoint of the photon belt, that time coincides very closely with a point in history that the ancients called the shift of the ages. And as we go through our magnetic models and the models of base resonant frequency of the Earth, you will see what those parameters mean to our lives, and you'll see how those parameters timed synchronistically with the moving into the center of the photon belt, how they provide a very different and unique experience for us. I believe that this is a very healthy and a very natural process that we are moving into, is a process not to be feared, to be welcomed, as this photon belt is offering to you and I a reference signal, a reference frequency of light. And that will make more sense, and we'll refer back to this as we move through this body of information. And begin with the sun. Our sun, the radiant ball of light that we call our sun, is undergoing a tremendous change that began in the mid to late 1980s. What we began to see was an increased number of solar flares, solar prominences, tremendous X-ray bursts, solar flares that traveled across 93 million miles of space and actually lapped against the atmosphere of the Earth, interrupting our magnetic fields and playing havoc with our, wreaking havoc with our weather patterns. Well, in 1994, our scientists, American scientists, built a craft, the Ulysses probe. And we sent that craft to the sun to investigate further, to see what's really happening here on the sun. The first thing that they did was they traveled to the south pole of the sun to measure the magnetic fields. Now, we've measured these magnetic fields from the Earth in the past, and we've always believed that the sun, in fact, has a polarity in the magnetic field. And what we discovered in late December of 1994 was that as the Ulysses craft began measuring the polarity of the south pole of the sun, the readings were much lower than had been expected. The scientists said, well, that's interesting. Let's go to the equator and see what's happening at the equator. And it took a few more months, and by May of 1995, the Ulysses craft was at the equator of the sun, and again took readings, and to the surprise of our researchers, they discovered that the readings were very low and very similar to the readings that they had taken at the South Pole. So they said, well, let's go to the North Pole and see what's happening. So the Ulysses craft then traveled to the North Pole, we consider to be the North Pole of the sun, and what they discovered was this, that the readings from the North Pole, the South Pole, and the equator were very, very similar. There was not much differentiation between North and South Pole. And what scientists are actually saying now is that the sun has lost its polarity. The sun has lost the magnetic fields, the polarity of those magnetic fields, and has moved to what is called a steady state magnetic field. And that field is decreasing rapidly. Now, that will be important in just a moment. So I'll ask you to remember, to hold this thought, that the sun is losing magnetics, losing its intensity of magnetics very quickly.
One of the weirdest things about this claim from Gregg Braden is not even that he says that the sun is losing its polarity altogether, which it's not, but it's that he never mentions the 11-year solar cycle that has been mapped for a very long time and explains everything that he's talking about. He claims that scientists report that the sun has lost its polarity and that the magnetic field is decreasing rapidly. The only thing you have to do to prove this didn't happen is to go find some graphs or charts on the sun's magnetic field, and you'll see the variations are based on a well-known 11-year cycle. Here's what one solar physicist had to say about it while commenting on a recent solar magnetic pole shift in 2001. He says, "The sun's magnetic north pole, which was in the northern hemisphere just a few months ago, now points south. It's a topsy-turvy situation, but not an unexpected one. Quote, "This happens around the time of solar maximum," says David Hathaway, a solar physicist at the Marshall Space Flight Center. "The magnetic poles exchange places at the peak of the sunspot cycle. This transition happens, as far as we know, at the peak of every 11-year sunspot cycle, like clockwork." It's possible that because Braden was recording this video in 1996, at the low end of the sun's 11-year magnetic cycle, that he might have assumed that that cycle would last forever. But again, that would at the very least make him a terrible researcher, not to account for a cycle that was so well documented. In addition, I will link the notes and graphs from the magnetic field investigation on the Ulysses mission if you want to dig into that further.
Was that when you take the stuff our world is made of, a particle of matter, one particle, and even if you split that particle and send each portion to different locations, which is what this experiment did. They split one particle of matter and sent one particle 7 miles this direction, the other 7 miles that direction. They were 14 miles apart. And even though they were separated physically, they were still connected energetically. So that when one particle had an experience, they would disturb one particle, the other one acted like it was having the experience. Sometimes the other one would act like it was having the experience before the scientist even disturbed the first particle. And it's mind-boggling. He said, well, how can this be? But what this tells us is that once matter is physically joined, even when it becomes separate, the energy is still there that's connecting it.
The reason that PhDs with experience with quantum entanglement don't agree with Braden is not because this idea is too far out or anything like that, but rather because Braden is quite obviously misinterpreting the data of quantum entanglement. The more you understand about what quantum entanglement really is, the easier it is to see why Braden is wrong. A commonly debated use of the term refers to quantum mechanics, where if the outcome of an event has not been observed, it exists in a state of superposition, which is akin to being in all possible states at once. This is also referred to as entanglement. In the famous thought experiment known as Schrödinger's cat, the cat is supposedly neither alive nor dead until observed. However, most quantum physicists, in resolving Schrödinger's seeming paradox, now understand that the act of observation and measurement must also be defined in quantum terms before the question makes sense. This is the reason it drives physicists crazy, because they can't mathematically model it. And the reason science must come up with a third possibility, namely that the cat really is neither alive or dead until it is observed. So let me explain what these experiments are really showing by giving you an example, and you can determine whether what Braden is saying is true or not. Let's say you and I are traveling apart from each other in our very own spaceship. We are traveling apart at the speed of light, and nothing travels faster than this. So our communication channels are broken. You can't give a carrier pigeon a note for me because he won't catch up. You can't send an electronic message by email or telephone because they simply can't travel fast enough to reach me. We cannot communicate by any type of ordinary messaging. But before we left, we were given a magic package of light. We were told not to open our packages until we were very far away. The packages were wrapped up by a special machine, and nobody knows the color of light in the packages. We do know this, though, that they were created at the same time, by the same means, and therefore the two packages must contain the same color of light, either both red or both green. I open my package and I find a beautiful green light. The unextraordinary and unremarkable thing is, I know that your parcel must contain green light too, even though you have not been able to communicate this to me. This all seems pretty obvious to us, right? I mean, the light was either red or green. Nothing really happened when I opened it. Well, the problem is that it drives mathematicians crazy, because they want to know things for certain and want to be able to quantify it mathematically. But this in no way means, as Braden says so often, that all the particles in the universe are connected and that one particle feels what the other is doing. The EPR paradox and entanglement, nor the Heisenberg uncertainty principle has anything to do with that. There were a few times in this research where there was a problem checking Braden's facts because he was manipulating the footnotes of his books. This practice is extremely deceptive. Let me give you a few examples. Here's a claim from Braden.
First was conducted by a Russian physicist, Vladimir Poponin, in the early 1990s. He came to the United States to finish this series of experiments. And what Poponin did was he wanted to investigate the relationship between human DNA and the stuff our world is made out of, little packets of energy that we call photons, little particles of light, if you want to think of them that way. So the experiment consisted of taking a tube, a glass tube, drawing all the air out of this tube, creating what today we call a vacuum, implying that there's nothing left in this tube. However, we know that there's still something left, these little particles of light. So Popelin measured the particles to see how they were distributed. Did they fly all over the place inside the tube, or were they all accumulated at the bottom, or what happened with them? And the results of this part of the experiment were not surprising, because the little particles of light, the photons, were completely random, and this is what they expected. The next part of the experiment is where this gets really, really interesting, because they placed some human DNA into this tube. And the human DNA, when they remeasured the photons, the human DNA had caused the photons to form an alignment. The DNA was having a direct effect on the stuff our world is made of. Now, this is precisely what ancient spiritual traditions have always said, that something within us has an effect in the world around us. And Popenin's experiment, for the first time in recent times, is actually verifying this under laboratory conditions. And the next piece of the experiment is even more interesting, because what they found was that when the DNA was removed from the tube, we would expect that they would all go back randomly distributed just the way they were before. And this is not what happened. What happened was, even though the DNA was no longer in the tube, the photons remained aligned as if the DNA were still there. And the question is, why? What is it that causes this effect? There's nothing in Western physics that accounts for why those photons should remain in the position that they were in when the DNA that caused them to become aligned is now removed from the tube. This experiment is called the phantom DNA experiment because the effects last whether the DNA is there or not.
Gregg Braden's entire proof for this claim comes down to this footnote, which he says, the DNA phantom effect was first reported in Russia, and he gives these names, and he says, quote, investigation of fluctuation dynamics of DNA solutions by laser correlation spectroscopy. Bulletin of the Lebedev Physics Institute, 1992, number 11 through 12, pages 23 through 30, as cited by Vladimir Popelin in an online article, The DNA Phantom Effect, Direct Measurements of a New Field in the Vacuum Substructure. An update on DNA phantom effect, March 19, 2002, by the Weathermaster. So we go to this online article, which is not a scientific paper, but just a website, and we see the update that was mentioned is actually 2 emails that are posted on the web page by the request of the actual PhD scientists who were mentioned on this web page. That according to the emails, these scientists made the webmaster post them because the footnote that they were using had nothing to do with the so-called DNA phantom effect. An excerpt from the email is as follows. Peter Garov agreed and gave him the diagrams and the description of the method. Then an article of Popelin with the data of Peter Garov appeared on the internet in 1995, but without his participation. In this article, Popelin refers to the joint publication from the Investigation of Fluctuation Dynamics of the DNA Solutions by Laser Correlation Spectroscopy Bulletin of the Lebedev Physics Institute, but this paper is only about the DNA fluctuation dynamics investigated by a method with laser correlation spectroscopy, and there is no relation to the DNA phantom effect. So Braden's footnote to prove the DNA phantom effect is entirely fraudulent, and the website that produced it was forced to admit that it was. Another example of Braden manipulating his footnotes was noted by an actual Bible scholar when reviewing Braden's book, The Isaiah Effect. He says, and I quote, Gregg Braden refers to a new translation of the Isaiah scroll as if it might reveal some previously unknown secrets. Such a translation does not exist. The text of the great Isaiah scroll from the Qumran is very close to the Masoretic texts. There is an excellent parsed translation online at www.ao.net with commentary. Moreover, all of the citations of the book of Isaiah are from a standard version of the English translation of the Bible, all based on the Masoretic, not from his, quote, new translation, which is nowhere cited since it doesn't exist. Read the footnotes. He frequently quotes from Edmund Bordeaux Schletsky's The Essene Gospel of Peace. Whenever Schletsky is quoted, a sentence immediately follows referring to the Dead Sea Scrolls, falsely implying the quote came from the Dead Sea Scrolls or the book of Isaiah. Schletsky's work were published between 1932 and 1937, several years before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Isaiah effect is Braden's imagination based on Schletsky's imagination.
The second experiment is a fascinating experiment. It's a military experiment. And what they did, in essence, was they took some human DNA, some scrapings from the tissue of inside the mouth of a donor or volunteer, and they placed this DNA in a device that could measure its effects in one room of a building, while the donor that the DNA came from is in another room in the same building. So living DNA from one person, the DNA is in one place, the volunteer is in another place. And what they did was they subjected the volunteer to what they called emotional stimulation that would elicit genuine responses of emotion, of joy or sadness or fear or anger or rage in one part of the building, and they were measuring the DNA to see if the DNA would affect to the donor's emotions. Now, why would it? In Western physics today, there's absolutely nothing that suggests that that DNA is still linked to the donor on the one hand. And on the other hand, as they conducted these experiments, what they found was just the opposite. What they found was that when the donor was having his emotional peaks and valleys in one room, the DNA was having its emotional peaks and valleys in another room at exactly the same time.
This is the footnote that Braden uses to prove this outlandish claim. Julie Motz, Everyone an Energy Healer, the Treat 5 Conference, Santa Fe, New Mexico, Advances, the Journal of Mind-Body Health, Volume 9, 1993. I have contacted Julie Motz, and she said that she only mentioned this at a conference, and she admits she doesn't even know if it's true or who did the study. Instead of just quoting the study itself, Braden is quoting a rumor that he heard at a conference called Everyone an Energy Healer to prove that this Army experiment was indeed real. He then makes the footnote look very professional. I have contacted the Journal of Mind-Body Health, and in fact I should have another update about this particular issue in a few days, and when I do I will link it to this video, because I think that I have even more hilarious evidence on the way to show how badly Braden is stretching the truth.
Jupiter, a beautiful planet. I love to see these images, these computer-enhanced images taken from several different craft. The storm, this red eye that we see on Jupiter, this storm, apparently unlike any storm we've ever seen on Earth, because this storm was first recorded over 3,000 years ago by Chinese astronomers. And it has been continuously raging in the atmosphere of Jupiter for approximately 3,000 years.
Actually, it was first recorded by astronomers more like 300 years ago, not 3,000 years ago. It is known to have been in existence since at least 1831, and possibly since 1665. Based on the fact that Braden says a Chinese astronomer noticed it first, which is not true, it's probably likely that he was referring to the discovery of the moons of Jupiter, which were discovered by a Chinese astronomer close to 3,000 years ago. But if that's not bad enough, wait for his next claim.
Well, as you can see, this storm, the giant red eye in this storm, has a rotational component. You can see that there's a feel of a rotation on that component, or a rotational component on this storm. For over 3,000 years, astronomers have seen that rotation in a very specific direction. Something interesting happened in 1986, 1987, synchronistically perhaps, just about the same time that the sun began going through its changes with the increase in the solar flares and the X-ray bursts. This giant storm began to rotate in the opposite direction and continues to do so today.
I encourage everyone out there to go see if you can find any record of the Great Red Spot changing direction at any time. The Great Red Spot has always rotated in a counterclockwise direction since it was first discovered. In fact, one of the reasons that people believe that the storm will last much longer is because, unlike hurricanes on Earth, there is nothing on the surface of Jupiter to slow or stop this storm. Either Braden is just bold-faced lying here, or maybe he might have read something about how the Great Red Spot swallows other storms on Jupiter, which it does all the time. I'm not sure. One thing I am sure of is that the storm has never changed direction.
What would cause a rotation, a shift in an atmospheric phenomenon that has been constant for at least 3,000 years? What would cause that? 1972, 24 United States cities were used to conduct an experiment where people were trained to feel the feeling of peace in a very specific manner, and they were strategically placed in these cities. Each city had populations over 10,000 people. And these were documented in some of the very well-known TM studies that were done back in the early 70s. And what happened was, during the time that the people were feeling the feelings of peace, in the community around them, beyond the buildings where they were having their experience, the communities experienced statistically measurable reductions in crime. Violent crimes against people, traffic accidents declined. In some cities like Chicago, where the stock exchanges, the stock market soared while peace was in place. And when they stopped their prayers, all those statistics reversed.
Braden here is quoting a study done by a group called the Maharishi University, which teaches people how to do transcendental meditation, among other things. They make claims like this all the time, probably most famously in the study of theirs that is quoted in the cult classic What the Bleep Do We Know? Here's a clip from a debunking of that portion of the movie.
Experiment in the summer of 1993, where 4,000 volunteers came from 100 countries to collectively meditate for long periods of time throughout the day. The results, in fact, showed a 25% drop in violent crime in Washington, D.C.
Hey, John. Turns out we have something called statistics, and we can check your story. As it turns out, 1993 was a pretty bloody year for Washington, D.C. residents, and the 2 months of summer in question were particularly bad. Furthermore, the Independent Review Board were followers of the Maharishi. They were biased to find that collective meditation helps. A year after the experiment, John Hagelin submitted his 55-page report claiming an 18% reduction in crime. Washington Post asked, 18% reduction? Based on what? And John said he arrived at his figure by considering all possible variables. Turns out the variables included such random things as fluctuations in Earth's magnetic field. The year he spent on his report was for cooking it, constantly applying different variables until it could look like a reduction. But the raw numbers don't lie. Murder and rape were higher those months. Again, he was called out on this, and eventually he acknowledged that murders were up, but due to unusually high temperatures, and maintained that brutal crime was down. I guess those murders and rapes were less brutal that year, perhaps with cushions and on comfy chairs.
The following is a sampling of some of the quotes from the peer review of the particular study that Braden is quoting. Heinz R. Pagels, a Ph.D. of New York Academy of Sciences, said, "My summary opinion as a theoretical physicist specializing in the area of quantum field theory is that the views expressed in the literature issued by the Maharishi International University and appearing in World Government News and other publications associated with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi that purport to find a connection between the recent ideas of theoretical physics, unified theory, and a vacuum state of collective phenomena and the states of consciousness attained by transcendental meditation are false and profoundly misleading. No qualified physicist that I know would claim to find such a connection without knowingly committing fraud." And in fact, the former Dean of Faculty of the Maharishi International University had this to say, "During my time at MIU, I had occasion to examine the scientific claims of the movement, to interact with those who had reportedly performed the research, to study the metaphysics, philosophy, and religion associated with the TM technique, and to work with the founder of the movement and the college. It is my certain belief that the many scientific claims, both to the factual evidences of unique beneficial effects of TM and to the theoretical relationships between the experiences of TM and physics, are not only without reasonable basis, but are in fact in many ways fraudulent." There are many problems with this particular theory. For instance, the coherence group. The alleged coherence group was not even known to still be living in the areas of the original TM instruction, or even known to be still practicing TM, yet the TMO claims that the probability for error is 0.001%, that the effect of this unknown group caused an 8.2 decrease in crime. What we do know about the probability of the individuals continuing in TM practice, the 1989 Royal Bonnier study showed that the 20 months after the 505 individuals began TM, only 18.8% still practiced TM twice daily as instructed. And a 1980 report showed that 50 to 80% of those initiated gave up. So what would be another way to show these predicted results? In 1960, the Maharishi predicted that 1% of the population practicing transcendental meditation technique would produce a measurable improvement in the quality of life for the whole population. This is something that Braden later quotes. Number one, all you'd have to do is to obtain crime statistics for the nation covering several previous years, because they claim this phenomenon was first noticed in 1974 and reported in a paper published in 1976, but their study looked back at 1972 to 1973. So look at all the cities with a drop in the crime rate, match them to similar cities with an increase in crime rate. Number three, claim that the drop in crime was because of the impact of your particular product, service, or influence, shoot an arrow and draw a target around it. And voila, you have now proven your predicted results.
It links the DNA of all life to the letters of ancient alphabets in a very precise way. And this is a very bizarre way of looking at DNA. But what it says is that because of this mathematic link, we can take the letters of those alphabets and place them into the strand of DNA in precise places. And when we do that, following those instructions, lo and behold, the DNA begins to spell words, and the words begin to spell sentences, and the sentences make sense. And while we don't know precisely who or what is responsible for that code in our bodies, what it says to us is, number one, it says that we're here on purpose. We're no fluke of nature. We're no accident of biology. We are an intentional species. And that there is a message encoded. It's not on a temple wall or in a text somewhere that could crumble after a few thousand years. It's in the creation itself. There is a literal message, and the very first line of that message literally translates into the languages of ancient biblical Hebrew, ancient Arabic, and ancient Sanskrit. Precisely the same language literally says to us the words, God eternal within the body. God eternal within the body.
This is an interesting claim that is totally untrue. I will be quoting from the writings of a man who, up to this point, totally loved and trusted Gregg Braden. But when he went to a conference and heard Braden talk about this subject, he began to question him. And I encourage you to read his account to find out that this person isn't debunking Gregg Braden because he wants to, but because he has to. He says the following when speaking of Braden's presentation at the conference, but his next step is to say that the code is literally translatable into Hebrew, and he bases his grand hypothesis on just a single, very dubious four-letter correlation. To justify this revolutionary claim, Braden appeals to numerology. He says that because the base molecules in our DNA, the language codes of thymine, adenine, cytosine, and guanine, are made up of the elements of hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon, with respective atomic masses of 1, 5, 6, and 3, these are wrong, by the way, that they actually correspond with first, fifth, sixth, and third letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Therefore, they spell YHVG, which means God eternal within the body. And because Hebrew is a Semitic language, this supposedly works for Arabic as well. He then tells the audience that this has taken 10 years to translate this introduction to the DNA, or, quote, first level, but that the subsequent translation should now be much faster. Quite why such a basic numerological calculation would take 10 years is beyond me. It is easy to play around to get just 4 letters to fit, but then to state that this implies that the entire DNA is a library that will shortly be read in Hebrew with the right translation is absurd. The holes in his theory are very easy to spot and as wide as the Grand Canyon. Braden links the elements hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon to the Hebrew alphabet with atomic mass. But the respective atomic masses of these elements, which he gives as 1, 5, 6, and 3, are actually 1, 14, 16, and 12. To make the evidence fit, he has resorted to a numerological trick. 14 becomes 1 plus 4 equals 5, 16 becomes, well, 6, and 12 becomes 1 plus 2 equals 3. Also, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is actually Aleph. Yod, the Y in his YHVG translation, is the Hebrew letter number 10, but Braden justifies calling 10 a 1 because 1 plus 0 equals 1. The problem with this sort of fiddling is to get the evidence to fit your theory is that it invalidates the statistician's probability above. If unscientifically adding numbers together is okay, which is what he has done with nearly all of his evidence, then the following must be valid. Nitrogen with atomic mass is 14 could equally pertain to the Hebrew letter 14, 1 plus 4 equals 5, or even letter 15 by just getting rid of the 1 as he did with oxygen. Oxygen with the atomic mass of 16 could also be Hebrew letter 15, 5 plus 1 equals 6, or the Hebrew letter 16, and carbon with the atomic mass of 12 could also be Hebrew letter 12 or even 21, 2 plus 1 equals 3. But if the link is valid as he says it is, then it must be valid both ways. So Y, the 10th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, could be relating to neon, which has the atomic mass of 10, or manganese with the atomic mass of 55, or 5 plus 5, or silicon with the atomic mass of 28, which is 2 plus 8, or fluoride with the atomic mass of 18, which is 1 plus 8, or even radium with an atomic mass of 226, which is 2 plus 2 plus 6. There is huge room here to cook the facts, which is exactly what Braden seems to have done. So his revelation is just a clever numerological trick.
Because I believe that the fact, and it is a fact, it's not a theory, if you follow the instructions, this message is there. We can't say why it's there. It simply is there. Even more recently, the research that's been done by the scientist Masaru Emoto regarding the relationship between human emotion, human feeling, and water drops is showing this relationship even more poignantly. What has happened is that these scientists, this particular research project, has discovered that droplets of water that make up over 70% of our world anyway and 70% of our bodies, that these droplets of water respond to human emotion, whether it is felt in the body or as it is actually written on labels that are placed onto vials of water, and the emotion of the researcher as the labels are being written and placed onto those vials. The vials are then frozen for a specific period of time, removed from the freezing process, and as they begin to thaw, they crystallize. And the crystals are the telltale sign of what is happening with the emotion.
For this claim of Braden, I will refer to a recent video which is debunking the movie What the Bleep Do We Know, which uses this exact same theory.
Blessing from a Zen Buddhist monk.
Mr. Emoto took water and either thought really hard at it or attached written labels to the container, cooled the water until it formed crystals, and photographed the results. But it wasn't a double-blind test, it wasn't even peer-reviewed, and it has never been duplicated in any lab. Mr. Emoto freely admits this and says he's not a scientist. He hand-selected the results based on which ones visually matched the target word, and applied filters to the photographs to make them even more bright and sharp, or even more dark and distorted.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? If thoughts can do that to water, imagine what our thoughts can do to us.
No, thoughts didn't form the crystals, lower temperatures did. Different samples of water contain different minerals and purity, and even water from the same source will form different-looking crystals. Mr. Emoto's work is an art project, and has as much scientific value as a painting of a fruit bowl.
And I've been involved in experiments where hundreds of thousands of people joined together through the World Wide Web. We were coordinated on the internet at a given hour of time, a window of time, when we were trained to feel the feelings of peace in our bodies during that time. And when we did that, statistically, what happened in events around the world, there were wartime events. There were bombings, aerial bombings in Iraq that were scheduled, that were reversed during the window of time when this prayer was happening. Crimes against people declined. Emergency hospital room visits declined. There was a computer research project at Princeton University that was able to document the field of consciousness on a global level while these prayers were going on, and they saw a little glitch, a glyph on the screen indicating that consciousness was responding to hundreds of thousands of people feeling the feeling of peace in the moment that it was occurring. And what this tells us is that the field we're working with is a measurable field. You can pick it up with equipment. It can be measured on the computer screen.
He gives the impression here that there's some new equipment that can measure the emotions of the people of the Earth. And that's the entire centerpiece for this particular theory. But it's kind of funny if you actually know what he's really talking about. Because what this high-tech equipment is a random number generator. The following is an excerpt from an interview with Brian Dunning about this particular theory from Skeptico.com. It says, well, there's a couple of things that are wrong that you just said. One, that you're not going to find patterns in random data. Random means random. It doesn't mean smooth or evenly distributed. That's not random. Random is going to have spikes and troughs and lines and things that look unusual. That's the definition of random. The second thing that you said that's not correct is that I described a theory. What I just described, what they're doing, speaking of the Global Consciousness Project, does not remotely qualify as a theory. It doesn't even qualify as a testable hypothesis. They have no standards for what constitutes an event that might trigger one of these episodes. They also have no standards for what type of effect to look for in their data. And it's easy to find just about any kind of pattern you want. That's basically what they're doing. Basically, there's no reason to expect that random numbers are actually measuring the consciousness of the world.
Was with the edits of the Western biblical texts, the biblical traditions in the 4th century as well, in the year 325 AD. It was during this time in the early Christian traditions when the Emperor Constantine pulled together a council. And at that time there was no biblical text, nice, neat, compiled text the way we see it today. It was a loose assemblage. Many of the texts were redundant. Some of them were poorly written. And very few people were able to access this material. And Constantine, in an effort to make it more accessible to a broad general audience, pulled together a council within the church and said, "Council, make me some recommendations. What should we leave in? What should we take out? How should we arrange this material?"
This couldn't be any more untrue. And I'm no fan of Constantine or the Catholic Church, but no historian, no matter what their personal beliefs, would agree with these statements that Gregg Braden is making. Basically, he's just repeating what Dan Brown of the Da Vinci Code said. But let's take a look at the details for ourselves. The first 300 years of Christianity, Christians were being tortured and killed with regularity by the Roman Empire. But right around the time of Constantine, it was decided to stop killing Christians. And then Constantine came along and put Christianity on equal footing with the rest of the religions in Rome. Some say it was elevated a little further than the rest of the religions because Constantine himself claimed to be a Christian. The Council of Nicaea was Constantine calling all the independent church leaders from all around the Roman Empire to settle an argument that was happening because of a man named Arian. The church leaders at this point were still very skeptical of Rome because they had been slaughtered by them for almost 3 centuries. So they all heard this man named Arian speak, and then they took a vote as to whether they thought he was correct or not. They decided that he wasn't, and that was basically it. Constantine would be long dead before any of the conferences dealing with the canon of the Bible would be called, which shows that Braden either has no idea what he's talking about or he's lying. But what is further is that the churches uniformly agreed on what books should be read and what books were obvious forgeries, and they did this naturally, without the need of a council or an emperor. The conference that did happen later, that so-called canonized the Bible, was exactly consistent with the ancient writings of the early persecuted church, which were clearly writing about the same books, and they did this 150 years before the Council of Nicaea. They all agreed on the 4 Gospels and the letters of Paul, etc., and they all clearly wrote and uniformly agreed that the books like the Gospel of Thomas were obvious forgeries, which wasn't a really hard thing to do because even the people that were promoting the Gospel of Thomas admit that it was written at the very least 100 years after the real Gospels. You can look all this up. This has nothing to do with personal preference. It's a matter of archaeology and anthropology. For more information about this, see my video, The Council of Nicaea Myth Debunked.
Well, through these Essene traditions, we are given insights into the life of a man, a reference being, and I say that very intentionally, a man who came as a human to live among humans, to learn what humans had learned. A man we now know is Jesus of Nazareth.
Braden will continue to say this throughout the presentation, that the Essene traditions referred to Jesus somehow, but they don't at all. Another thing that might confuse you is Braden also mentions the idea that Jesus came here as a man. And at first you might think that he's talking about Jesus being God, like Christians, but he's actually referring to a common New Age concept of Christ being a high ascended master, who's kind of like an angel. In fact, later on he shows Christ as the Archangel Michael, which is a Jehovah's Witness belief.
That this initiate, Jesus of Nazareth, lived the life that you and I have learned to live. He learned a trade. He lived. Archaeological records now are showing that the little village that he lived in wasn't so little at all. It was a booming metropolis of about 40,000 people. He learned of commerce. He had to do everything that you are learning to do in your life. He had to master the emotions of his life in order to proceed through the choices that he was making in his life. I particularly love this image of Jesus as an initiate, as a student learning. This is again from Cheryl Yombrock Rose. The title of this image is Christ Anchoring the Celtic Ray.
Before I make my point about all this, I want to point out the obvious, that no matter how nice it seems like Braden is talking about Jesus, what he is doing is giving him a massive downgrade. It's a common tactic in cults, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, who say that Jesus was just a great angel, or the Mormons, who say that he was just a regular Joe who got his own world, just like every one of the Mormons are promised to rule over one day. Or like the Satanists, who make him less than Satan, or as we're hearing right now, sort of the theosophical idea that Jesus was just another ascended master that comes every now and again and was showing us how to be compassionate so that we can learn how to ascend just like he did. No matter which way you look at it, it's still a massive downgrade.
In England, is one of the sacred sites in England. So through the Essene traditions, what we are shown, what we are told is this, that at least once, one man, Jesus of Nazareth, remembered the true nature of his being, the nature of compassion, and we'll define that compassion genetically in just a few moments. He remembered that compassion, he became that compassion in his life, and in doing so, allowed a biochemical shift in his body, a genetic change, a reordering of genetic coding. You'll see all of this very, very clearly with schematics and drawings in just a few moments. And in that reordering, he allowed himself the opportunity to live a phase transition, to live a change of state. And today, we call that change of state resurrection.
Okay, so the point that he's making here is that Jesus got so good at compassion that he raised himself from the dead. You have to ask yourself the question, though, is if he was dead, how did he use all the compassion? Or was he not really dead? And if he was dead, how is his teachings going to help us? Because I don't think any of us can use our compassion after we die.
Resurrection is a path. This man, Jesus of Nazareth, anchored this wisdom. He lived among us and anchored this wisdom in our conscious matrix. He became the living bridge for us 2,000 years later so that we would have access to his wisdom as we actually live the transition, as Earth actually carries us through the transition.
Even from a very secular or non-religious standpoint, what Braden is saying doesn't make any sense. Let me explain why. Many people try to say some variation of this about Jesus, which is that he's a great moral teacher or a guru, while at the same time saying that he wasn't God in the sense of the God of the universe. But this man said he could forgive sins. He said that he was the one that was going to come and judge the world at the end of time, and he was the only way to the Father. He allowed people to worship him on no less than 3 occasions. A man who said and did all that and was not the God who created the universe would not be a great moral teacher or anyone to look up to. He would be a madman. The Pharisees of Jesus' time were constantly trying to trick him to say plainly what he was implying all the time, which was that he was God. And eventually Jesus did tell them that he was the God of the Old Testament, and that is why they ultimately killed him, for blasphemy. I will let C.S. Lewis explain why Braden's view about Jesus makes no intellectual sense.
Then comes the real shock. Among these Jews, there suddenly turns up a man who goes about talking as if he was God. He claims to forgive sins. He says he has always existed. He says he is coming to judge the world at the end of time. Now, let us get this clear. Among pantheists, like the Indians, anyone might say he was a part of God or one with God. There would be nothing very odd about it. But this man, since he was a Jew, could not mean that kind of God. God, in their language, meant the being outside the world who made it and was infinitely different from anything else. And when you have grasped that, you will see that what this man said was, quite simply, the most shocking thing that has ever been uttered by human lips. One part of the claim tends to slip past us unnoticed because we have heard it so often that we no longer see what it amounts to. I mean the claim to forgive sins, any sins. Now, unless the speaker is God, this is really so preposterous as to be comic. We can all understand how a man forgives offenses against himself. You tread on my toe and I forgive you. You steal my money and I forgive you. But what should we make of a man, himself unrobbed and untrodden on, who announced that he forgave you for treading on other men's toes and stealing other men's money? Asinine fatuity is the kindest description we should give of his conduct. And yet this is what Jesus did. He told people that their sins were forgiven, and never waited to consult all the other people whom their sins had undoubtedly injured. He unhesitatingly behaved as if he was the party chiefly concerned, the person chiefly offended. him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to.